right, this is a video for the A&P students over the urinary system. We're going to continue on with the objectives for exam 4, so you can find that under objectives exam 4. I have them pulled up already. So the first video we talked a little bit about the general functions of the urinary system and the kidneys. We've got a little bit of information about nephrons. So this video we're going to talk about a structure that you didn't identify in lab, so it's a new structure, but one that we need to be familiar with because it'll have a role in the physiology that we're going to talk about with the kidneys. So it's called the Juxtaglomerular apparatus. Crazy name, but juxta just means near, and then glomerular is that word that refers to the glomerulus, which you learned about in lab. So there's a little group of structures and cells that make up this juxtaglomerular apparatus. So we want to know where it's located and what things are part of it. So, all right, so I'm going to go to a picture in our book. There we go. Okay, so this isn't exactly like the models in our lab showing the nephron. Our model in lab was pretty dated, but hopefully you can tell that this is that little ball that kind of surrounds that's the Bowman's capsule that's surrounding our glomerulus, which is the little red capillaries that you see in there, and there's a glomerulus afferent arteriole coming in and an efferent arteriole leaving. So that we're gonna look at the glomerulus or renal corpuscle. That was the whole thing, which included the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule and the capsular space. So the nephron really has like two parts. So the renal corpuscle we consider one part, and then all the tubes, which are proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule, and collecting tubules and ducts are the tubule portion or part of each nephron. So if we're looking at the glomerulus, we just kind of enlarged it, and we actually kind of took off the side here of this renal corpuscle, so we can actually see those little glomerular capillaries that are running through that renal corpuscle. And we got our afferent arteriole and our efferent arteriole, and then this would be where the filtrate, anything that leaves the blood capillaries, these glomerular capillaries, and gets into the capsular space, is going to head down the tubules, starting with the proximal convoluted tubule. All right, so the juxtaglomerular apparatus, you can see that over here. It's made up of these two structures. So it's a little hard to tell here, but this little brown tube here, that is the distal convoluted tubule. And so it probably wasn't real obvious in lab, or we didn't point it out anyway. But whenever the distal convoluted tubule is kind of twisting, heading towards our collecting tubule, it will pass right by the renal corpuscle, specifically the afferent and efferent arteriole. So this little guy here is the distal convoluted tubule, and then it's kind of turning towards us now, and we cut it in half. So this is the wall of the distal convoluted tubule, and that's the lumen in there. So the juxtaglomerular apparatus, part of the cells that make this apparatus up, they're called the macula densa cells, and they're part of the distal convoluted tubule, and they're special cells. It's kind of hard to tell, but they are a little bit taller than the other cells that are making up the wall of the distal convoluted tubule. But those are the macula densa cells, and we'll talk about their actions. But they're making up the part of the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And then this is the afferent arteriole, we said. And then in the afferent arteriole, so we have our little cells that are lining it. There are special cells called granular cells that are located, there's one there, in that wall of the afferent arteriole. And those little walls, you can see how they're very closely or basically touching each other. So they sit right next to each other. So that allows for them to communicate, which they will do. All right, so that's the parts of the juxtaglomerular apparatus. I think they also mention these mesangial cells, the extraglomerular ones that are in here. I didn't include those. I just kind of focused on these two parts of the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Realize a little bit later on in videos, these are extraglomerular mesangial cells here, which I don't have you know much about. But I do have you know about mesangial cells that are actually intraglomerular. They're actually within the glomerulus. And so you can see them here. They're like located between all the glomerular capillaries. So we will talk about them. They'll play a role too that we'll talk about later. But just realize these mesangial cells are the ones we'll talk about and not these. All right. So that's the structures that are making up our juxtaglomerular apparatus. So the macula densa cells and the granular cells. All right. So now if we go back to our objectives, name the location and explain the two actions of the granular cells. All right. So our little granular cells. Oh, yes, we're doing granular cells. Did they mention? Yes. So granular cells, and sometimes you'll see them juxtaglomerular cells. I just use granular cells. I think that's easier, but if somebody likes that one, I can include that too. But these little guys are smooth muscle cells, which makes sense because there's smooth muscle in our vessels. So those are smooth muscle cells. So they're going to contract, obviously. So that's one of their roles. They'll contract, and they'll either do it because they get stretched, or they may do it because the nervous system tells them to do it, which we'll talk about that a little bit later too. And then the other thing they do is they're not technically, they're part of the circulatory system, so we don't really consider it a hormone from the kidneys. But those cells are also going to produce, and actually, I guess hormone, I usually call it a hormone, but they call it an enzyme. So it produces a hormone/enzyme called renin. So renin is also one of their functions. It produces renin. Of course, it does it only when it's stimulated to do so. So it makes the renin, and then it will release it too. And again, this will all come together more when we start talking about the regulation of the kidneys. So, all right. So that was the two functions of our granular cells. And then our macula densa cells, they're just little epithelial cells that are located along here, but they have a special purpose because they have little receptors that can detect the change in the sodium and chloride. So the sodium and chloride, or the salt, that's inside that distal convoluted tubule. So they're able to detect that sodium chloride concentration or amount in the distal convoluted tubule, and then they'll respond, and we'll talk about how they respond in another objective. So, but that is there, so they're detect changes in the sodium chloride concentration of fluid within that distal convoluted tubule. So, and then we'll talk about what they do. So just that's kind of the anatomy, and a little bit of their, what their general function is, and we'll get into more of how that is going to kind of be carried out in the physiology of our kidney. So, all right, so that was our juxtaglomerular apparatus. All right, so I'm going to go on and talk about, enlarge these two, and talk about the flow of filtrate, tubular fluid, and urine as it goes through the nephron and then through the other parts of the urinary system. So these will be, a lot of the structures we'll talk about are the ones you guys have already identified in lab and learned about. So, so first, make sure you know the filtrate. Make sure that you know that any fluid that is filtered is called a filtrate. It's kind of a general term. But in the kidneys, at our glomerulus, these little capillaries, blood gets filtered out of these capillaries, and then it gets into this space that's kind of between the glomerular capillaries and the Bowman's capsule. And so that fluid in there is called the filtrate. So filtrate is just any fluid that's filtered. In this case, it's the blood. So it's the components of the blood that are filtered, end up outside of the glomerular capillaries in our capsular space. So, all right. And then we'll talk about tubular fluid, just the fluid that in the tubule. So as soon as the filtrate leaves the Bowman's capsule, then it's going to enter the proximal convoluted tubule and then on to the loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule. We start calling it tubular fluid at that point. And then not until it gets to those collecting ducts do we start calling it urine. So realize that we filter the blood here and get a filtrate, and then the tubular fluid that runs through our proximal convoluted tubules, loop of Henle, and distal convoluted tubules, it gets that tubular fluid gets altered, so it's not actually going to all be left, end up in the urine. So, and we'll talk about how it gets altered along this way. But then by the time it gets to the collecting tubules and then onto the ducts, then we consider it urine at that point. So, all right, so this, we just want to know the flow of these fluids through our nephron and the urinary system. And there is a picture. We already talked about blood flow. There we go. So here's the picture. Probably can't get it all on here. We'll start at the top here. So in the capsular space, so this is where the first fluid is formed from the filtering of the blood. So it's called the filtrate in the capsular space. When it gets into the tubular fluid, when it gets into the tubules, we start calling it tubular fluid. And it's going to go through the proximal convoluted tubule first. Remember the descending loop of Henle, the ascending loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, and then into the collecting tubules, and then into the collecting duct. So then from there, once it leaves the collecting duct, then we start calling that fluid urine. And so now realize that urine is going to go through those little papillary ducts that we learned about in lab that are located where the renal papillae are. Goes through the papillary ducts. Those little papillary ducts, and remember this is all all the tubes are merging together, so because we want to get the urine all into one area eventually. So all the little collecting ducts merge into papillary ducts. All the papillary ducts merge into a very large duct, but it's called a minor calyx. And then you'll have a couple minor calyces that'll drain their urine into a major calyx. And then we'll have more than one major calyx. So we have major calyces that will then drain all their urine into our renal pelvis. And that's actually where all the urine eventually, from all the nephrons, the millions of nephrons that are in our kidneys, all the urine finally ends up all together in that renal pelvis. And then from there, down the ureter to the bladder to the urethra. So that's what you should know about how the urine filtrate tubular fluid, how it flows through the urinary system, and when we call it filtrate, where it's at, and when we call it tubular fluid, where it's at. So, all right. Oh, and we already distinguished between the filtrate, tubular fluid, and urine, so we are finished. So I'll have another video that goes over some more information.